So it's been quite a couple of weeks in this country. Whether you inhabit a black body, a brown body, a white body, a gay body, a straight body, a transgender body, an Asian body, whatever body your spirit inhabits, whatever body your soul calls home, there is no denying that this has been quite a couple of weeks. Certainly when we gathered for worship last week, we were still raw from the pain of having witnessed the shooting in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. We knew as we gathered that we had witnessed an act of true hate. And over the course of this week, we have seen our black sisters and brothers in this country mourning for those killed. And we have seen sisters and brothers of all colors, in all types of bodies, standing beside them in solidarity, mourning with them, crying out with them. We have seen our president stand at a pulpit and open his mouth to sing the words of Amazing Grace, a song that is beloved in our Christian tradition, but that perhaps becomes all the more poignant at this moment in history when we consider that the words of Amazing Grace were written by John Newton, who was a white slave trader turned abolitionist. And he wrote the words to Amazing Grace based upon his own experience of remorse and having changed his way of seeing the world, his way of being in the world. John Newton came to his own moment of amazing grace. And from that, he penned the words that President Obama stood and sang as he eulogized a slain black preacher in this country. Are we as a nation on the verge of our own amazing grace moment? We may well be. Certainly in a lot of ways it felt like an Amazing Grace kind of moment on Friday morning when the Supreme Court issued its majority decision that equal marriage, that is the fact that all people now have the right to enter into civil marriage in equal measure, was now the law of the land. What Massachusetts began back in 2004 by legalizing gay marriage has now become the law in all 50 states across the country. And while we may not be the first, or the second, or the third, or the fourth, or fifth, or sixth nation to do that, it's still an important and a good step. And as the decision was read and as people began to rejoice, it seemed like perhaps we were beginning to touch on that kind of amazing grace moment. Because no matter what kind of body we inhabit, the words that Justice Kennedy used as he wrote that majority opinion, those get to the heart. Those really get to the heart of what it is to be embodied, of what it is to be flesh and spirit. And I want to read you a piece of that decision. Justice Kennedy wrote, "No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people become something greater than they once were. As some of the petitioners in this case demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law." They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. That the court recognized that fact and that there was widespread general celebration that followed, that's getting to the heart not only of that particular issue, that's getting to the heart of what it is to be human. We are all desirous of equal dignity. No matter what kind of body we inhabit, we are striving for, we are hoping for, we are yearning for others to see us with eyes that view us with equal dignity. We're yearning for the circle to be opened wide that we might step in, that we might be accepted. And that's a yearning, that's a hope, that's a pain that all of us who live in a body, all of us with an address for our soul, know in some measure. Because it is scary. It can be risky to be embodied, to be spirit inside of flesh, to be putting ourselves out there with our own unique bodies, our own unique ways of being in the world, our own unique hair colors and styles, and the way that we present ourselves, and our vulnerabilities, our scars, our tattoos, our brokenness, our hope. All of those things, putting that out there to the world and hoping for equal dignity. But it would be inauthentic for me to talk about being in the body this week and not talk about the pain and the hoping for equal dignity that people inhabiting black bodies and brown bodies in our country have known, and the pain that people inhabiting gay bodies, transgender bodies, bisexual bodies in this country have known. That longing for equal dignity, that is certainly a longing that any one of us can understand. As we put ourselves out there into the world, and we hope and we pray that those who share this embodied experience with us will look upon us with the loving eyes of Jesus, rather than the cutting eyes of the world. Now, in a lot of ways, it would be unfair to just say that being in a body makes us all alike, because we know that being in a body is what connects us one to the other, but it also is what makes us the most different from each other. We have to own that reality. After all, my experience, my soul's experience of being embodied in a female lesbian body will always be different in the world than Kent's soul's experience of being embodied in a straight male body. And both of our experiences will be different in the world than my friend Harold's experience of being embodied in a black man's body. Harold is a friend of mine from seminary who has actually preached here in this church a few times. You may remember him. He's from Gary, Indiana, and currently is serving a black church in Alpharetta, Georgia. His experience of being in the world as a black male preacher will always be different than mine. And your experiences of being in your unique and particular bodies will inform your own stories. And they will be unique and distinctive from mine. And yet, even as we can acknowledge that being embodied is what makes us most different from each other, we can also say that it is the thing that most unites us. And I want to read to you from An Altar in the World, just one piece of this chapter, where Barbara Brown Taylor speaks about that, speaks about what it is to be connected in the body. She says, "My body is what connects me to all of these other people. Wearing my skin is not a solitary practice, but one that brings me into communion with all these other embodied souls. It is what we have most in common with one another. In Christian teaching, followers of Jesus are called to honor the bodies of our neighbors as we honor our own. In Jesus' expanded teaching, by example, this includes leper bodies, possessed bodies, widow and orphan bodies, as well as foreign and hostile bodies, none of which he shied away from. Read from the perspective of the body, his ministry was about encountering those whose flesh was discounted by the world in which they lived." Wearing skin, that experience of wearing skin, is not a solitary practice, she says. The experience of being embodied in a unique body distinct from everyone else's actually is what most connects us to everyone else. And that's what I think is so special about the Incarnation. The Incarnation with a capital I, the one that refers to Jesus. Because it is in Jesus coming to be in the flesh that we are both most unlike Jesus and most like Jesus. If you think about it, each of us is born into our own particular body, our own particular appearance, our own particular social and economic and political location. We're born into these unique stories. And so was Jesus. There are a lot of ways in which I am not the most like Jesus. I am a woman, and Jesus was a man. I am a lesbian, and we know nothing of Jesus' sexuality. I have white skin, and Jesus' skin would surely have been brown. I speak English and some Spanish, and Jesus spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. I was born in the United States in the 20th century, and Jesus was born in the 1st century in the Middle East. There are so many things that separate us, separate our embodied experience, and what I think the incarnation really has to teach us is that in those differences, in the way that Jesus enjoyed a particular embodied experience just as I do, that is how we are most alike. That is how I am the most like Jesus, and how you are the most like Jesus. Your body inhabits a particular place and time, a unique story, and yet, in that uniqueness, in your own singularity, you are the most like Jesus. God come to earth to know uniqueness and a particular bodily experience. Not only to experience what it was to be human, but to show we who are human how to be the most humane. Being in a body is a unique and a special experience. And it's no wonder that Barbara Brown Taylor writes about honoring the body. Our bodies are the thing that bring us closest into communion with the divine. What an interesting juxtaposition. The thing that would seem to keep us the most tied to this earth is also the thing that connects us most deeply to the divine. The divine who entered into a body and lived on this earth. That's the story of incarnation. The Word made flesh, walking and living among us in a particular and unique body, as particular and unique as yours. How can we not then honor that unique story that each of us lives? But this isn't about just glossing over the differences among us. That would be too easy, and it would also be inauthentic because we see difference. We know it's there. But what if we could shift our lens? Just shift our lens a little bit so that instead of operating in a mode where difference needs to be categorized or stratified, or we have to form some kind of a hierarchy or organize it in some way, our human brains like organization. We like to understand where things go. But what if instead of in our desire to see difference and understand it, we could honor difference? See it, acknowledge it, hold it as true, but honor it. We know differences exist in our embodied experience. We see it, we experience it. But what if we could get to a point where we saw and honored those differences as part of each of our unique story, where we saw each of our differences with that unique dignity, that equal dignity that Justice Kennedy writes about, and that Barbara Brown Taylor talks about. Barbara Brown Taylor talks about Jesus' breadth of teaching. When you look at his physically embodied teaching, she says, his teaching was about being with those, connecting with those whose flesh was despised by the world in which they lived. Jesus didn't not see difference. It's that he was able to honor difference and to treat difference with equal dignity. And that, I think, is what the incarnation is to teach us. But it's not as easy as it sounds, right? If it were as easy as it sounds to just say, see difference and don't be bothered, see difference and treat each other well, if it were that easy as saying it, we'd have done it. There are things in our human experience that sort of clutter up the path, that get in our way. Politics, rhetoric, our own speech and emotions, and we get stirred up. 24-hour news networks that have to crank out news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Those things get in our way. They get in our way. They cloud our vision of seeing with equal dignity. And our own fear. Our own fears get in our way. When I was first here as a student minister at First Baptist Church in Beverly, the Senior High Fellowship put on a brief play during one of the worship services. It was called Us and Them. And some of you may have been there for the play. I somehow ended up with a part in it, actually, which I wasn't anticipating. But it's a great play, and what happened in the play is that there were two groups of characters. It's a very simple story. Two groups of characters, and one wears one color shirt, we had blue, and then the other group wearing a different color shirt, we had red. And the two groups begin to wonder about the other group, wondering about each other. And then they begin to get worried about each other. So they decide to build a wall between them. So they build a wall, and then on either side of the wall, they begin to wonder what the other group is doing. What are they doing? And one of the most poignant lines in the play for me was when the two groups are sitting on opposite sides of the wall, neither group doing anything, and they are obsessed, driven by their fear of what's happening where they cannot see. And one of the characters says, I wonder what they're doing on the other side of that wall. I wonder what they're doing on the other side of that wall. And on the other side of the wall, another character echoes the line to her own group, I wonder what they're doing on the other side of that wall. And the audience sees what the characters in the play cannot, which is that neither group is doing anything except worrying about the differences of the other. And the audience sees that the characters cannot, which is that it is their fear that has divided them. We have our own walls. Whether we put them up or our society puts them up for us, we can think of the walls, white, black, Christian, Muslim, gay, straight, transgender, cisgendered, male, female. We could go on. We can think of the divisions that society helps us to create. And we sit on the sides of our walls and we say, I wonder what they're doing on the other side of that wall. But it is our fear that divides us. Jesus, incarnated in a body like ours, came to say, you don't need to be afraid of what's on the other side of that wall. The people on the other side of that wall may look different than you, they may act different than you, and that may be true. But you need not fear their differences. Barbara Brown Taylor talks about the responsibility that comes with living in a body, with being incarnated just as Jesus was. She says, when we are in a body, the words of our doctrines become flesh. The words of our doctrines become flesh. What we think, what we believe, those things aren't just theoretical and abstract. When we're in the body, those things are real and lived and practical. So we have a real and practical responsibility to follow Jesus' footsteps in that breadth of his teaching that Barbara Brown Taylor says was about reaching out to those whose flesh was despised by the world in which they lived. All of us may have had a moment when we've felt that, when we've felt on the outside of the circle, when we've felt despised by some corner of the world in which we lived. It is our call to follow Jesus in reaching out to those who are in those places, reaching out to those who are in those margins, putting our doctrines into flesh, living them out. Barbara Brown Taylor says that when the person of Jesus had gone, the disciples still had the word. The disciples still had the word, and I think this applies for us today as modern day disciples. When the flesh of Jesus had gone, the disciples still had the word. But, she says, they were going to need some new flesh for it. They were going to need a new place to carry that word with them. And what she says is that it was in their own bodies. And in giving them the communion meal, the Last Supper, Jesus reminds them that they need to be together bodily and physically to share not only a meal, but the word. So I think for us who follow Jesus today, the reminder is clear that the word is flesh in our bodies. The word is still with us, made flesh in our midst. When the physical presence of Jesus had gone, the word of God was still with them, but it needed new flesh. Yours, mine, Kent's, Harold's, President Obama standing at a pulpit to sing Amazing Grace, Justice Kennedy penning the words to a majority Supreme Court decision. All those who celebrated these moments and even those who struggled, we are all the Word made flesh. We are all embodied, worthy of respect, yearning to be seen with equal dignity. So are we on the verge of our own amazing grace moment? Time will tell, and it's up to us. In each one of us, the words of our doctrines become flesh, no longer theoretical. When we step out our door, when we put our feet on the ground, we put our doctrines into practice. What we do, how we live, matters almost more than what we say. That's why Jesus went to those people on the margins. His teaching was not just verbal, it was embodied. And may our teaching be embodied too. You know, I think as we think about our call, as we try to move together towards this amazing grace moment, it may be that a children's educator had it most right. Fred Rogers, who people lovingly know as Mr. Rogers, who so often had the wisdom and the gentleness to put words to what all of us were feeling, said, "We want to raise our children so that they can honor and enjoy not only their own story, but respect and enjoy the diversity of others." We want to raise our children, and we want to raise up our own childlike, fragile, hurting, longing, hoping spirits. The childlike spirit that indwells each one of us. We want to raise those up to respect and enjoy our own story and to respect and enjoy the stories of others. The diversity of stories that surrounds us. We see the difference. Will we see them with equal dignity? The Word made flesh. Jesus came to live in our midst to show us what it might be to be fully human. The Word made flesh is here in this room, in you, in me. And when that's the case, there is no limit to what yet might be. Amen.